Hey, welcome to the Big Me Kickoff. I am your host, Kevin Noon. It is Thursday, November 18th, and we are closing in on the Michigan State game. This is the second Big Me Kickoff this week. This is the first week we rolled out two editions, and I'm really excited because, the first one you just got stuck with me solo, but this time around, I am bringing in a special guest. I am bringing in Josh from the College Football Nerds. And if you spend any time on Buckeye Scoop, you've seen them. I will be sure to put their YouTube channel down in our comment section so you can find it. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Always enjoy talking with you guys.
Yeah, we've had you on before, and obviously for people who have not had a chance to check out what it is y'all do, just a little, an overview of what your channel's all about.
So our channel focuses on game and team previews. So we're an analytics or stat-based channel, and what we really try to do is come up with numbers that matter in college football, and then have an honest discussion about what the numbers do and don't tell us about a given team. One of the more difficult things about this sport, especially compared to a lot of others, is that a lot of the data lies to you. And when you look at the NFL and a lot of statistics in football that are derived around the NFL, those stats tend to be built around the idea that you got a lot of parity, right? Any team in the NFL can beat any other team in the NFL in a given day. And what we try to be honest about is, hey, we can run a look at who has the best total yardage or who has the best quarterback rating, or even go further into advanced statistics. But those things sometimes are and sometimes aren't reasonable or reliable depending upon the matchups, the quality of opponents. Now, we have a model we run in our previews, and we start only about halfway through the year because our model is based off looking at your quality and at your opponent quality and having a really opponent adjusted look at your statistics and metrics. And we feel like you can only really do that when you start getting into the season and you start getting some baselines. So a lot of our discussion, while it tries to be very objective, is also objective with an idea that, all numbers lie. And I think that's the thing that we usually find the most interesting in college football.
Yeah, and the numbers certainly, when I go through tail of tape, I don't do a lot of the, advanced metrics and things like that. I look at a lot of just the numbers, and it's even to the point of looking and jumping ahead a little bit to Michigan State, and they can be 130th in passing defense for yards allowed. They're middle of the pack in pass efficiency defense, but then you can get into so many more stats. And I was probably born about 15 years too early to really get into all of these stats. When I was a younger man, I was totally into all the numbers. I would have totally been into sabermetrics and baseball and EPA and everything else that we're doing now. I'm just too old to grasp all of it, and that's why I bring guys like Josh on, who can sit there and kind of look at what some of these numbers mean, and have and maybe the more predictive nature that you're going to get from that, just opposed to saying, well, so and so threw it for 312 yards against so and so therefore, transitive theory means this is going to happen.
Yeah, and I could give you an easy off-the-cuff statistic for Michigan State, right? They're 130th against FBS teams in passing yardage per game. But if you look at yards per attempt, they're actually 43rd. Is that great? No. Is that awful? Not really. Notre Dame's 38th. So when you start looking at the statistics for Michigan State, yeah, their passing yardage that they've been giving up is really bad, but it's because nobody wants to run on them. And everybody throws because the passing defense, I don't think it's bad so much as it's a lot worse than the rushing defense. And that skews total yardage. And if there's one statistic that our channel wants to kill, it's total yardage in college football, because teams play at different tempos, teams play different schemes. If you're in a conference where everybody plays up tempo and they're throwing the ball a lot, your total yardage statistics are going to be garbage. And it's not going to mean you're bad. It just means teams threw a lot more passes. And that's always a really difficult thing. And I'll give, the other thing I'll say offhand is people want to rag on like Georgia's offense. Do people realize Georgia is actually, I think, second or third in the country in points per drive scored? Even though their scores aren't very high, their offense is designed for ball control. They don't get many drives, and they don't give up many drives. And I think it does kind of underrate their offense, and maybe to some extent overrate the defense, because the opponents don't get many drives. And that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. But it's very relevant in this game, where Michigan State's statistics are so badly skewed because of the ways people like to play them.
And that leads me into my next question, kind of talking about this upcoming game, Ohio State, Michigan State, 12 o'clock Eastern on Saturday. When you look at this, and I know you guys have already done a preview, and I highly recommend everybody take a look at that. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, don't miss any of their great content. But what intrigues you most from just a number standpoint when you look at this matchup? I mean, we sit there, it's 4 versus 7, yet it's almost a 3 touchdown line. I mean, there's just a lot of things to take in here. What means the most to you when you look at it?
Well, I think there's two ways to take it. So let me ask you what you want to look at first. When you talk about interesting things to talk about, do you want to talk about the things that are interesting in terms of who's going to win the game? Or do you want to talk about what's interesting in terms of the takeaways for later on in the season? I mean, where do you want to start with it?
Let's talk about let's start with the first one, and then we'll move into the second one. Let's start on the micro level, just the game itself and the predictive nature.
Sure. So for this game, the interesting thing about it is totally the matchups. When you look at Michigan State uh, as a football team, I think their quality level, and we said this in our preview, on average, I would say they're a better team than Penn State. That shouldn't be shocking given their ranking and record. But I would say in this game, they are probably a less favorable matchup for Ohio State. And even our model didn't have this game quite as bad as the spread. But in making the predictions, I actually had this quite lopsided in Ohio State's favor. I'll go ahead and say that. And the reason for it is the way the matchups work for Michigan State kind of breaks things. And what they've been seeing all year is teams avoid what they're good at. In defensive success rate, Michigan State is 37th against the run, and they're 82nd against the pass. It is very Jekyll and Hyde. Ohio State, when they played Penn State, played a team that was really balanced in where they were good. And I'm not sure actually how much better they are than Michigan State defensively. I know they are better, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily as much worlds better as you might assume. But the difference is that Michigan State has a major flaw. Now, the problem for Michigan State is they're playing an Ohio State team that is almost uniquely able to exploit them in the passing game. Now, I went on the Kelly Ford Ratings podcast and actually picked Purdue outright to beat Michigan State. My entire justification for that was matchups. Purdue was a team that cannot run the ball and can only throw it. And Michigan State was kind of the dream matchup for them. And I thought they were going to win that game outright, which is a rare thing for me to pick an underdog to win. It's just actually not that likely in college football. It's not basketball, guys. Underdogs, even though they do happen, underdogs don't win very frequently, at least not enough that you want to bet on it, right? But Ohio State has all those advantages and then some. So let me walk through a couple. Offensively, Ohio State is the number 2 EPA, that is basically efficiency in terms of point potential from yardage passing offense in the country. Michigan State is 55th. In rush defense, EPA, which is maybe a more nuanced look, again, Ohio State's 39th on offense. Good, but they're not fantastic. And I think a lot of Ohio State fans recognize that. Michigan State is actually 4th in EPA adjusted rushing defense. In other words, when you start dealing with where they face runs and how they handle them, they're extremely effective. So the reality for this game is that Ohio State's biggest strength goes up against Michigan State's biggest weakness on the defensive side of the ball. To me, that's going to lead to a lot of points. Now, there's on the other side, I will say defensively, Michigan State is actually one of the better passing offenses Ohio State faces, 43rd in EPA passing. Ohio State is still 68th in pass defense. And when we ran, our internal numbers, when we do our modeling, Ohio State doesn't hold up very well there either. We note that Michigan State is giving up 98% of opponent passing averages, but Ohio State is giving up 96. So almost the same number. I think personally, this is going to be a high scoring game. I don't know that I'd want to touch a spread that's 19, though I'd pick Ohio State with it. To me, the 67 number is the one that seems a little off. I think this is going to be a very high scoring game. I think the problem for Michigan State is whatever number they want to hit, Ohio State can almost comfortably hit about 3 touchdowns more. It's always dangerous because it just takes a couple turnovers in that kind of game for it to get close. But from a matchup perspective, it's pretty simple to me. There is a path for Michigan State to hit 25 to 35 points in this game, but there is equally a path for Ohio State to hit, I would say, even 50 plus. So I think this is a very high scoring game. And I think as good as Michigan State is, it's just such a horrible matchup. in that they're going to, and I think it's a lot like the Minnesota game and the way that played out. No matter what Michigan State does, and no matter how effective they are, Ohio State's just going to turn around and score in like 3 plays if they really want to, and that tends to make games almost impossible to win.
And while you guys look at the numbers, I sometimes look at the Jimmies and Joes. And with Jalen Naylor, he didn't play last week. And if they lose him, I mean, obviously they still have Jaden Reed, but, a pretty big downturn. I mean, you got go down to Trey Mosley, tight end Connor Haywood. But losing Reed would be, or Naylor would be a huge loss for them in terms of what they might be able to do on their passing offense. And then do they look to go more to Kenneth Walker? But, I've talked about that a little bit more this week on some other shows. You'd mentioned, from looking at the numbers and everything else, what this means maybe moving forward, and that will go well into my next question, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in on that.
Yeah, and I think that's where you start getting into the takeaways you can take. When we did our preview for Georgia Tennessee, we made the point that neither one of us thought Tennessee had any realistic chance to win that game. Our curiosity would be, could a Tennessee team who's a legitimately good passing offense actually throw the ball on Georgia some? Because Georgia's corners are new and they're largely untested. And I think you see some of the same stuff here with Ohio State. I mean, coming up to this point in the year, what would you say is the best passing offense that Ohio State has faced? I mean, and I'll ask for your opinion. Who do you think is the best passing offense that Ohio State's faced at this point?
Probably Purdue, just based on numbers. I mean, but then again, it's such a skewed offense. I mean, I'll say Purdue. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're going to probably tell me Nebraska or something crazy like that.
Well, and I don't know that I would. I mean, Nebraska has a higher yard per attempt average, but that's where we get into the fact that stats lie, right? Nebraska barely attempts the throwing the ball in games where they're struggling, and there's been this weird thing with them that their stat lines almost look like triple option teams, and they're so RPO based that they're kind of taking shots for big yardage, or they're not throwing it, but they don't get any efficiency gain out of throwing the football. So, I'd argue, Purdue may be your best analog. I don't know that Purdue has high-level athletes or a great passing offense. They're fairly efficient and effective, and they move the ball some on Ohio State. But I don't think there's any doubt that Michigan State is a lot more balanced than Purdue. Michigan State, I don't know that their passing offense is actually that much less effective. They just rely on it less. But in the run game, Kenneth Walker is a different beast, right? And I think really this is going to demonstrate a lot how much Ohio State has put together things that they had going wrong on the defensive side of the ball, because Michigan State is going to run a modern offense. I give Mel Tucker a tremendous amount of credit for how much he's modernized that program quickly. And they stress you in different ways than most Big Ten teams do. I'll be blunt. A lot of the Big Ten is still a little bit behind the curve when it comes to modernizing how they play offensive football. But you can tell the teams that are adopting modern approaches are starting to take big steps forward. Michigan State's ahead of the pack on that, and they've got better talent, I think, than a lot of other teams. So, to me, it's not about whether or not they win or lose or how much they win or lose by. I don't take much away from Ohio State scoring a ton because of the matchups involved. But to me, defensively, I want to see, can you actually keep Michigan State to like 20 points? Or do you get in the uncomfortable like 40 to 60 kind of game that was like Indiana last year, Minnesota early this year? And those, to me, are the canaries to say how you're going to hold up in the playoffs, where you're going to face a team that is as balanced as Michigan State, but just a lot better. And those are the games where Ohio State has struggled a lot in the postseason at times in recent years.
Yeah, and you look at Michigan State, and they show you this new world of the portal. They go into the portal, they get Kenneth Walker III. They go in and get Quavaris Crouch. Like they get guys that they can step in where Mel Tucker hasn't necessarily had enough time to turn things around with recruiting. Toward the end of the Mark D'Antonio era, they started to see recruiting slip a little bit. So, I think if you have a good coach with a good plan and they have a product to sell, they can go out and get some of these guys. Earlier in the year, you guys did a preview of what a hypothetical UGA Ohio State game might look like. And, I was very interested in it. It made the rounds on social. How, have both these teams kind of lived up to what you guys were seeing there? Have there been any major deviations? I mean, are we on track for what we kind of saw there? I mean, if that game happens, or is it not so much?
our model had that about dead even. And honestly, I think it's still pretty much the same boat. And I'm citing advanced stats, not because I necessarily say them to be the be all end all, but it's a lot easier than just throwing out a random opinion, right? Like Ohio State's third in EPA rush defense. Ohio State already said, and our metrics we do with opponent averages, I'll tell you they are again 96% passing averages and about 82% of opponent rushing averages. That's just a flat, unadjusted stat. It's a tough matchup for Georgia. Ohio State is better at stopping the run than they are stopping the pass, at least relative to competition level. Georgia, their strength is definitely run defense. They are on historic tracks in terms of run defense. Their pass defense still has not faced a real high level offense, which is as Michigan fans can attest to in the Don Brown era, can present some really unique challenges, right? And sometimes defenses that are total lockdown against an average passing offense or run first teams can look extremely mortal or bad when they suddenly get spread out and exposed with a team that can throw vertically. So I don't know that any game with Georgia is going to be terribly high scoring, but Ohio State still has that balance and the ability to throw and hit explosive shots, the ability to play very effective run defense, believe it or not. They've played a lot of good rushing offenses, and that's been a big part of it. That I think they can make a definite game of it. And all I've seen from these two teams is they've continued to show their strengths. I think they've both shored up their weaknesses to the extent they had them. Kind of to equal measure. Ohio State's been up and down. I mean, I'll be real. There was this period where every Ohio State fan on Twitter was telling us that they were the best team ever and we weren't giving them enough credit. And our point was, look, man, it's Akron. It's hard to really take anything from those. And the past couple of weeks, they've looked very good, but you still see signs of the same problems. I don't think Georgia or Ohio State, either one, would be dominant against each other. I don't see how you could really project that game right now. And the real problem is, I just don't think that Georgia's seen any analog for Ohio State's passing game. Won't maybe until they face Alabama. And for Ohio State's perspective, I just don't think they've seen any team that's even remotely as talented overall as what Georgia brings, because they're a top 3 roster in terms of overall talent for sure.
And that brings me into the college football playoff rankings. We just had those on Tuesday. Ohio State's still sitting 4th. It's UGA, Alabama, Oregon, Ohio State, and then you've got Cincinnati, Michigan State to round out the top 7. What are your thoughts on just the college football playoff rankings setup in general? Because you can come at this from, much more of a statistical point. We had a comment that came out from Gary Barta, the chairman, saying, watching the games aside, which was just a real ludicrous statement in terms of the comparison between Michigan and Michigan State. I'm here to judge these pies, but aside from tasting them or even looking at them, here's what I know. I mean, what are your thoughts about just where we are with just this process of picking 4 teams to put in a playoff?
Yeah, look, I don't envy the position that the playoff committee's in, and we have generally not been particularly hostile to them. I think more often than not, they get things a lot better than the AP does. And the AP makes some really baffling decisions. They'll have a team that, one team lost to another team, and they'll be completely flipped in terms of who goes where. And they do that all the time in the AP poll. It drives me absolutely nuts with no other justification, really. NC State would be my big example as a team that was really high at one point in the AP poll, and they weren't ranking Mississippi State, even though I know Mississippi State had that's like they lost to Memphis, but Mississippi State had just drug NC State up and down the field. And one, I don't know how you make those comparisons, but two, at that time, I don't know how you could have NC State as like 13th in the country and then have Mississippi State unranked with those data points. The playoff committee, though, still has some things I don't quite understand. Oregon ahead of Ohio State. They won the head-to-head. I get if you want to say they're both one-loss teams. They won the head-to-head, that you have to give an edge to Oregon. Our approach when we do our own rankings is always, if you traded schedules, how would you look? And I assume when you trade schedules, if I know that you beat each other, I assume that's going to happen every time. So I kind of put it in my mind that Oregon's always going to beat Ohio State. But when you look at the rest of the schedule, Oregon's schedule is not very hard, nor do they look very impressive. So I find it a little odd. And I find it especially odd because you play that game, but with Michigan and Michigan State, Michigan beat, lost to Michigan State, but then you put Michigan State behind them. So I don't understand the inconsistency there. But I do think it's a lot due to the fact that Michigan really has a much harder schedule than Michigan State. And I can tell you, Michigan's strength of schedule for an elite team right now is 31st. Michigan State's is 56th. And until recently, it was like 80s. So that I think those differences explain it. But beyond that, look, I've got no problem with Georgia 1, obviously. Alabama at 2. I hate the thing where everybody calls A&M an unranked loss, because the truth was that was a team that had a stupid loss early and people way overreacted. It's one of the more talented teams in the country, and they've been pretty dominant outside that. Oregon, Ohio State, you've covered. And then it gets a little weirder when you get into Cincinnati, Michigan, Michigan State. And I think it's a little bit of what have you been able to prove. Cincinnati, I almost think they're too high based off where they've been the last few weeks, because they don't look like a team that could even really hang with a Michigan or Michigan State right now, much less the actual playoffs. But beyond that, look, everybody has such confounding best losses, worst wins. And if you want to play the game of you lost to such and such and our only loss was to X, you have to turn it around and say, yeah, but they beat 3 ranked teams. Mississippi State was the example. I think they had 4 ranked wins. They were the only ranked team that had 4 ranked wins. And then they had some of the worst losses of any ranked team. How do you deal with that? Look, none of it really matters outside the top 4 anyway, but I don't think anything they've done is necessarily overly ridiculous. I think it's all pretty fair in a year where no one has clear advantages and everybody has pluses and minuses with their schedule and resume.
Yeah, it's odd and sometimes to see what their reasoning is. And it's become kind of a running joke each week that they say, well, we start over each week. Well, yeah, and you start over because your criteria seems to change each week. But I digress. I'm sure there'll be time for that another time, another place, another show. But
yeah, and the one thing I'll say there is, I think sometimes they have a problem where the spokesman doesn't communicate the rationale very well, and that was really a problem in recent years. I think the committee was making really rational decisions when you looked at the list, and what they were doing, to me, had a lot of consistency to it the past few years. And then they get out and the spokesman, I think, just did a terrible job of communicating it. So you always wonder how much of that is the game of telephone that's being played from the decision makers to the spokesman.
Right. When you've looked at Ohio State, and you guys have certainly done several previews of them throughout the course of the year, with Ohio State being a top 5 team, good part of the year, top 10. What's the most surprising thing that you've found about the Buckeyes as you've watched them this year? I mean, or even more so, gone through the numbers, run things through the model, things like that.
I think the thing that is most surprising to me is that they made some of the shifts they did defensively, and then they didn't give up as much as a result as you'd think. And what I mean by that is, we were super critical of that single high safety scheme they were running under Coombs for years. You know that. We were really critical of it. But our criticality was, we didn't feel like it was a viable scheme to beat a high-level opponent who could actually produce multiple vertical threats in a game. It put a tremendous amount of strain on your corners to be able to defend that with single high, and especially with the ability to manipulate the safety with the RPO. They've gone to, more of, I would say, traditional defensive looks. They've simplified things. They're not straining as much, not putting as many guys in the box. And then you still end up in a situation where you're 96% of opponent passing averages and you're 82%, which is a pretty good number against the run. I would have thought that the run defense would take a good step back when they made these changes in exchange for the passing defense getting better. And it actually really hasn't materialized statistically. And I haven't been able to wrap my head around it. They've been better overall, but it's just generally been an across the board better. It hasn't really been a different statistical profile. And yeah, I haven't really figured that out yet, to be honest. I know there's some other guys out there, even including on some of your own sites, do a better job of that analysis. I know Ross does a great job, but I haven't been able to figure it out personally.
Well, I don't know either. I mean, we just knew that it needed to be different, and we see sometimes where they look better, sometimes where certainly some personnel issues in terms of not having a lot of depth at safety, but that's more of a Ross thing. I know I bring you on to talk some numbers and things along those lines, so I won't get too lost in the weeds since you guys do such a top down look at college football in general. Um, Settle a debate here. We've heard the old sport saying that offense sells tickets and defense wins championships, but then there's the other school of thought saying that in like that short period of time, that that 2 game tournament that the college football playoff is, that a good offense is always going to defeat a good defense. What do you think, or what do the numbers show, or do you think one thing and the numbers show something else?
Yeah, I'm glad I can settle this debate now because I'm sure whatever answer I give is just going to end all questions that ever come up ever again. My opinion on it is that good offense is more important than good defense in the current era, both in terms of playoff and the rule set. The RPO broke football because the problem with the RPO is that safeties no longer can really key run pass. Is the simple truth of it. If you try to key run pass, you're going to give up big vertical shots because you're going to be wrong. And the ability to block downfield means a safety can't read the lineman and know if it's a run or pass play. So crashing the line of scrimmage becomes almost impossible. Every game is played on your heels. And everywhere around the country, every major team complains about their safeties constantly. And I wish I could get everyone to understand safeties are never going to be really good ever again. They're just kind of floating corners that can make an emergency tackle now. And that's about the best a safety can be unless you get super aggressive with them and then then you take risks in other ways, which we've seen with Ohio State in recent years, even with high-level safety play. But the thing with a good offense is, one, you can exploit those things defensively. And then two, in a playoff scenario, you're going to be in a game where the other team can score, and you're going to have to match that score. And the reason defense won championships is that defense gives you consistency. Run game and defense is how you keep from losing a stupid game. Because if the other team, if you're playing a bad team and you have a serious off night, let's say Alabama LSU, where they just were in a total funk offensively, their defense won them that game. And that's how you keep from dropping, and Ohio State's had a couple of examples, right? You lose to Iowa or you lose to Purdue in a game you don't want to lose. If your defense is really, really good and consistent, you don't lose those when you have a bad night. But that was in an era where you had to be number one in the polls, or you had to be number one and two, or number two and make the BCF. So you really couldn't afford any losses. So you absolutely couldn't afford a stupid loss. Now in the playoff era, man, you don't even have to win your division. So you can afford to have a defense that gives up a game where the offense goes cold and still easily make the playoff in most major conferences. The bigger problem now is you're going to have to beat back-to-back 2 high-level teams. And whereas before, you could be 2012 Alabama and luck into playing 2012 Notre Dame, who was a great defense, really limited offense, and that defense had its own limitations that got exposed. In 2012, they win the national title because that's the team you happen to face. Now, even if you get, let's say 2018 Notre Dame, you got to turn around and then play 2018 Alabama or 2018 Oklahoma. And so you're not going to win that unless you have a high-level offense that you can win the next game. So I think good offense is now a requirement to win a championship. I don't know about this year because I don't know if there is an elite offense out there, period. I think Ohio State's the closest thing to it, but it's definitely a reset year at the quarterback position. We can get into that, but I would point you to a few years ago and look at the quarterback rankings that came out. Look at the list of quarterbacks, and I think you'll see why there's kind of a problem because there was a bit of a hole there compared to the Trevor Lawrence to Mac Jones groups. But yeah, I think good offense wins. And the more they expand the playoff, the more it's going to be true because you can afford those mulligans. And it's going to be about the team that gets hot offensively, especially in the passing game, because passing games travel, man, in the playoffs. And that, I'll say with that too, like we talk about opponent passing averages, we have teams like Georgia this year that is in the 50 percentiles in terms of opponent rush averages allowed. I think they're like 56% of opponent rushing averages. You don't ever see someone holding you below about 70% of opponent passing averages. Even like 2016 Bama, this year's Georgia, 2018 Clemson, doesn't happen. Passing offenses are going to be like 70% or above. It travels, even against an elite team. So that's the thing you need. If you've got a great elite passing offense, it's going to scale pretty well. It's going to travel will you to the playoffs. And that's the thing that's going to win a playoff game, especially against a team that's, honestly built a little bit like Georgia, a team that wants to run the ball and play defense. Well, maybe you can still hit 35 and they can't hit that number against your defense. And that's the name of the game to win in a playoff.
You see, so there you go. That's it. It's definitive. Josh has put it out there. Quit asking. We've got it. Offense greater than defense. So, and to be continued, I'm sure. I want to thank you for being part of the show. I want to wrap things up. What is one thing out there that that maybe we're not talking about enough, and it doesn't have to necessarily be Ohio State. I mean, just college football in general. I'm setting it up for you right there. And I know we didn't really prepare for this one, so I'm talking to give you a minute to think here. What is it that, as your parting shot that you want to just impart upon all of the listeners here on the Big Me Kickoff?
Well, I think I'll say two things. One, I think this year really emphasized the fact that if you play average to slightly above average teams and you look mediocre at it consistently, it's fair to criticize you. Because that was the story with Oklahoma, right? Our channel, a lot of other places didn't buy into Oklahoma because of how they were playing against the teams they were playing. It didn't look great. We didn't buy they were going to be with a high level team. And it may turn out they lose to the only ranked teams they play, maybe even lose by double digits to that. But on the same coin, I think you got to give a lot of credit to the playoff committee and to the way this system's been set up. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that Cincinnati has been way above undefeated Oklahoma since the rankings released. Mm-hmm. And everybody wants to complain about the G5 not getting in. Look, I have major issues with saying the G5 needs to get in for the sake of the G5 to get in. You don't rank conferences. You don't do a gimme or it's like giving somebody a penalty because you're trying to make up for another one, right? You got to take every year as it is. Cincinnati has to get in on their own accord. There's not a G5 conference, right? It's teams that get ranked. But if you want to talk about fairness, man, they've been ranked ahead of undefeated P5s this year. And I think that says a lot about how much the committee does value playing actual P5 out of conference competition if you're a G5. And honestly, I think, if Oregon loses a game, which is possible, or Alabama loses to Georgia, I think you're going to see Cincinnati in the playoff. I think they did it in a consistent and a fair fashion. And frankly, I don't think people have much of a leg to stand on if they want to gripe about it. So that's been my biggest takeaway from this year, honestly.
Well, there you go. I mean, I've been skeptical about Cincinnati in terms of if it's a 4-team playoff, they're not going to be higher than 5th. If it's an 8-team playoff, they're not going to be higher than 9th. But there's still a lot of football left to be played, so you don't know what could happen, where they could move up. But Lord knows they've not been super, impressive. I guess that's the word I'm looking for in some of their wins, but just keep winning. That's all you can do at this point. But they certainly have the smallest target to hit.
Yeah, they do. I mean, Notre Dame ending up a top 10 team, which we could get into a whole other story there with Notre Dame, because I kind of wonder if they're a merely good team that's been against a pretty average schedule. But yeah, I mean, Cincinnati, they hit their targets. They have to continue to hit their targets. And with Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State all playing each other, with Alabama playing Georgia, almost certainly, the window is wide open for them to roll in, and I think they're doing it in a natural and fair way. At least that's my opinion.
Well, we'll check back once we get to the college football playoff final rankings the Sunday after championship weekend. We'll have a lot of time to talk between then and the start of the bowl games of consequence that really aren't until the very end of the year. Josh, I want to thank you for being part of the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to thank everybody for watching here on the Big Me Kickoff. Once again, I'm your host, Kevin Noon. Be sure to check everything out here at BuckeyeScoop.com, and we'll talk to you again very soon.